Hola, bienvenidos! In today's video, we're going to take a look at el imperfecto, or the imperfect tense. Let's take a look. Alright, so let's break down some information that's really important to take into account before we get too involved with this tense. The past in Spanish. Now, something we need to recognize is that Spanish breaks the past down into two categories. The preterite, which you've probably seen before. If not, you can check out these other videos. And the imperfect. So you've probably, like I said, seen the preterite prior to this. It's the typical one to start with when you start learning the past. Now, the preterite and the conjugations associated for it are used when we talk about completed actions in the past. So saying like, I did my homework last night, it's done, it's over. A sequence of completed actions. So like if you talk about how you got ready for school yesterday, actions with a set duration. I did my homework for 30 minutes, for example, or an action that happened a set number of times. So I did my homework 5 times last week. 5 times would be the set number. All these things basically boil down to done actions. They're over, and that's expressed in Spanish using the preterite and its corresponding conjugations. On the other hand, we've got the imperfect. Now, the imperfect is used for routine actions in the past, so things that were more or less habits, or to give descriptions, or ongoing actions. So if you want to think about it this way, the imperfect is about setting the scene. It's about giving all the auxiliary information, whereas the preterite is what drives, let's say, the narrative of something forward. So if you're thinking about like the imperfect and you're thinking, and you've read plays before, let's say, when you read a play on paper, there's usually an italicized part at the start of the play to give you all the background information. It sets the scene for what's about to happen. That's what the imperfect does in Spanish. So these special conjugations we're going to learn give us that information, the details, the descriptions, the background information we need. Or, like I said, routine actions or ongoing actions in the past as well. And we'll break that down a little bit further. If you want to think about this, you've probably seen other duos in Spanish, like Sarah and Star. They both work in similar situations, but the meaning is different depending on which you choose. This is the same thing, but now it's with a verb tense. So the preterite and the imperfect. We're going to just focus on the imperfect and perfecting that. As you get more advanced, you'll learn how to use the two simultaneously, side by side, in context together. Alright, so just like the preterite, the imperfect has its own set of uses that need to be memorized. There's a couple different acronyms out there to help you with this. The shorter of the ones I work with is waters. The reason this works as a visual too is because water is something that flows, right? Think of the ocean, think of rivers. It keeps going. And that's going to be a continuing theme that we see with the imperfect. So how does that break down? Well, we'll start with weather. Anytime you want to describe the weather in the past, like you're saying, oh, it was sunny outside, the sun was shining, that's going to use the imperfect. So if I want to say it was very sunny out, hacía mucho sol. I'm using the imperfect to give the weather. It's a type of description. Age is going to be the same. When I want to state someone's age in the past, I use the imperfect tense. So if I want to say I was 6 years old, I would say yo tenía 6 años. Now remember that in Spanish you say you have a certain number of years instead of you are a certain number of years. So we always use tener with age, just like this. And then we'll use the imperfect once again. Time. By this I mean anytime you want to state what time it was, as if you were looking at a clock. That's going to require the imperfect tense if it's in the past. Eran las 3 de la tarde, so it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So again, you're reading it as if you were reading the time, but in the past. Any sort of emotion or state, that's going to use the imperfect as well. So for example, yo estaba alegre, I was happy, for an emotion example. Yo estaba cansada, for a state. So a physical state for me in this case would be I was tired. Now for the R, we've got repetition and continuous action. So repetition is what we're talking about as far as habits go. So things that you used to do in the past. So when we translate these, it could mean used to, or it could mean would. So not would in the sense like, oh, I would like some water, please, but would in the past. So my family and I would go to the beach each year. You'll notice that in the way I said that, it's implied that it was a habitual action. I said each year, and the would keeps that meaning as well. Íbamos a la playa cada año. We would go to the beach each year. So the would or the used to is not a separate term at all. It's just built into the conjugation in the meaning of the sentence. How do you know if something's a habit? Well, you'll see keywords that indicate repetition. So in this case, each year. But you could see terms like every Monday, cada lunes, los lunes. Or you could see something like cada año, each year. Or maybe con frecuencia, por lo general. Things that trigger that it wasn't just a one-time action, that it was repeated in some sense. Now what about this thing, continuous action? That's a little bit different. Continuous action is fancy for an ing. So anytime we want to express something that was ongoing, an ing in the past, we can use the imperfect tense. So for example, yo hablaba en español. This could be translated as I was speaking in Spanish, that ing. This would usually be followed up with more information, like I was speaking in Spanish while my friend was studying. Or maybe I was speaking in Spanish when the phone rang. But this ing portion, that's what's our continuous action. It was ongoing. Just a fancy way to convey ing. But that comes from the imperfect in the past. You'll notice, just like with repetition, there's no extra words to convey any of this. It just comes from the conjugation itself, and with the speaker, listener, writer, reader being familiar with these uses of the imperfect, and that this is what it conveys. That's what the meaning behind it is. Now let's talk setting or descriptions. So if you want to say where something was, that would be the imperfect, or to give general descriptions. That's a big function of this tense because, again, remember, it's used to set the scene. So with setting, la casa estaba muy lejos, the house was very far away. And then for general description, el libro era grande, the book was big. Anything that you're giving general background information falls into this category, and that's why we're using it with the imperfect. Alright, now let's talk conjugations. Just like other tenses you've learned, the imperfect tense is going to have very specific endings to convey the meanings I talked about on my previous slide. So you need to memorize not only the uses of the imperfect, but what the new endings are for when you conjugate. So if you're dealing with an AR verb and you want to say something in the yo form, you take off the AR and add aba. To form, abas. Él, ella, usted, aba. Nosotros, habamos, accent on the first day. Vosotros or vosotras, habáis. No accent. And then ellos, ellas, ustedes, haban. So if I want to use hablar, for example, in the imperfect, it would conjugate as yo hablaba, tú hablabas, él, ella, usted hablaba, nosotros hablábamos, vosotros habláis, ellos, ellas, ustedes hablan. It sounds made up, but it's totally true. So these are the endings we add on if we're working with an AR verb, keeping in mind that the nosotros this time around in this tense is where our accents are going to hang out for this. Now, what about the ER and IR verbs that are out there? And again, we're talking about regular verbs, so they'll follow this pattern and they will use all the same endings. Well, lots of accents coming our way. Yo form, ia. To form, ias. Él, ella, usted, ella. Nosotros or nosotras, íamos. Vosotros or vosotras, íais. And lastly, ian. Notice that for these, conjugations, every single form has an accent over that first I. Recognize that as a pattern, so you don't have to think, okay, which ones have accents? No. Make it simpler. They all have accents on the first I. That's the rule you need to remember. Now, if you're super observant, you probably notice something really funky beyond just that these endings sound a little funny. Senora, what is this? The yo form and the ella usted are exactly identical. How am I supposed to know the difference? Well, for whatever the case, in this tense, yes, those conjugations are the same. The endings are the same for your verbs. So if you were to say hablaba, I just love it. It just sounds so made up, but it's not. It's great. Or anything for ER, IR, like comía, for example. If you just have the verb, there's no way to know if you're talking in the yo form or el, ella, usted in these isolated words. Of course, you could add more context clues around it in prior sentences, for example, if it's a big paragraph. But more often than not, in this tense specifically, we do include the subject pronouns just to provide clarity with these specific conjugations, since it's easy to get them confused if you don't have any other contextual clues to help you. Now, the best part about this tense, conjugations for irregular verbs. Oop. Why? Because guess what? There's only 3 in the entire tense. These are it. There's no more. I'm not hiding any from you. This is it. There, we remember as to see or to, watch TV, for example. Ser, to be, as in things from doctor. And ir, to go. Now, all of these have irregular conjugations, which means they don't follow the patterns on the previous slide. They just have to be memorized. Let's start with ver. It's the easiest. There actually behaves like a normal ER verb would, except we would expect when we conjugate that ER would disappear. But with this verb, we actually leave the E and just take off the R before we add the endings. So there's not much weird about it other than that. And here are your conjugations. Veía, veías, veía, veíamos, veíais, veían. Notice again that the first I in the ending is where that accent mark's going to go. So again, not really that irregular, it's just you have to remember to leave the E. Ser and ir. Now these ones are totally weird. It's just straight up memorization and getting used to them. So ser will look like this. Era, eras, era, éramos, erais, eran. Noticing that nosotros gets the accent mark. And again, I know this one is funky, it just comes down to memorization, so anytime you want to use ser, these are your go-to conjugations in the imperfect. Now, ir. It's important to note, this means to go. I'm not talking about IR verbs. For whatever reason, people mix these up all the time in this tense. Ir, anytime to go, is the conjugations we're going to be working with here. Iba, ibas, iba, ibamos, ibais, iban. Again, nosotros is where the accent's going to go. So you'll notice that these two verbs have that in common. Again, recognize patterns. It makes less work for yourself. But again, this is the verb to go. It's not IR endings for IR verbs. It's only for the verb to go that you can use these conjugations. Well, that's it. That's the imperfect tense. So things to recap. When do we use the imperfect? Remember that there's 2 past tenses in Spanish, 2 simple past tenses. So you need to make sure that you memorize when to use the imperfect with that WATERS acronym or another acronym that works for you. Memorize the conjugations for the regular verbs for AR, ER, and IR verbs. And then memorize the 3 irregulars, keeping in mind to watch out for ir. With to go, we don't want to confuse it with IR verb endings. And that's that. So thank you for joining us, and I hope this video was helpful. Take the time to practice and really get used to this tense. Gracias, nos vemos.